Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar this afternoon. I'm Caitlin Bergstrom. I am a public affairs analyst with AGU, and we are very excited to welcome Augusta Wilson and Lauren Kurtz from the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund for our webinar this afternoon, East Coast time, talking about scientific advocacy and congressional powers. So a couple of quick housekeeping notes. Please type in the questions that you have along the way into the questions box there, and we will answer them all at the end. Augusta, Lauren, take it away.
Thanks so much, Caitlin. Thanks so much for having us. I'm Lauren Kurtz, and I'm going to kick us off with just some background on the ways that Congress has not always played well with science, and talk a little bit about that. And then I'll hand it over to my colleague, Augusta Wilson, who will talk about what scientists can do about that. We both work at the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund. Some of you may have encountered us before. We do programming every year at AGU Fall Meeting involving scientists and their legal rights and responsibilities. We used to work more on state level issues, but in recent years, we've explored more the federal space. There's always been a lot going on with science and the federal government. So without further ado, I will launch into it. Augusta, could you go to the next slide? So I was going to start off by talking a little bit about the ways in which congressional actions can have great influence on how science is conducted. You know, for example, the Trump administration has proposed budget cuts to scientific agencies and science grant making that were rejected by Congress. In fact, Congress provided increases in some situations, but scientists, unfortunately, have also experienced trouble in Congress, sometimes related to their attempts to engage in policy advocacy, but also sometimes just related to their scientific research. So our talk is to discuss not only some of what can happen when Congress acts poorly, but hopefully inspire you to become more involved in improving the state of affairs in Congress. So the first thing that I will chat about is the unilateral congressional subpoena power. Some of you may remember Lamar Smith, who is no longer in office, but was for many years. He left Congress in 2018. And he was a great fan of the unilateral subpoena power, which is one that unfortunately has great power for misuse. The unilateral subpoena power lets a congressperson issue a subpoena, which is basically a legal request for documents or testimony. And I use the word request in sort of the legal sense of the word. You know, it is something that you are obligated to do, although not everyone follows those strictures. In any case, a unilateral subpoena, as the name suggests, allows anyone to issue this without sign-on from anyone else in Congress. In theory, this should help ensure that investigations are done quickly and judiciously, but as you may expect, this can also go awry. So in historic times, the unilateral subpoena power was limited to just a few committees. It was most notoriously used by Senator Joseph McCarthy. You may have heard of the McCarthy hearings, who repeatedly used his unilateral subpoena power and other tools to target those who he thought were suspected communists in the 1950s. But in 2015, Congress expanded the number of committees with unilateral subpoena power, and this included the House Science Committee, which at the time was chaired by Lamar Smith, as I mentioned. And he used it to great effect. He issued dozens of unilateral subpoenas. He himself expressed great skepticism in the scientific evidence for human-caused climate change. And so climate science was a frequent subject of his investigations. I won't go into great depth, but you may remember back in 2015 and 2016, he repeatedly subpoenaed scientists at NOAA and tried to get information from them about studies they had done regarding ocean warming. Lamar Smith was of the opinion that these studies were somehow politically manipulated in relation to Obama-era priorities, you know, regarding the Paris climate talks and other efforts to combat climate change. The studies themselves had said the oceans were warming faster than previously anticipated, and Lamar Smith thought that they may not have been scientifically valid and were politically influenced studies. This was disproven, and the investigations ultimately went nowhere, but it was unfortunately a real incident of one senator, or excuse me, in this case, a House of Representatives representative going quite strongly against science and scientists using his congressional investigatory powers. Next slide. The unilateral subpoena power itself is not entirely a bad thing, obviously. I've illustrated some examples where it was used overly aggressively, I would say. But there's also instances where, you know, both parties have appreciated using it. Now that the Democrats have House control, they have used it, albeit less commonly than was used previously, but it has been used. Most recently, it was used in some of the investigations that have happened this summer regarding issues at the Postal Service and subpoenaing Postmaster General Louis DeJoy. Next slide. One thing that we have worked on at CSLDF, and I think is worth illustrating just so the scientists listening to this can sort of see some of the worst case scenarios that I hope none of you personally experience, but do happen, where individual scientists can find themselves targeted as a result of their research or their advocacy. On the left is Joe Barton, who was chair of the House Energy Committee in the early 2000s. He did a number of investigations into Michael Mann and other climate scientists who were earlier proponents of, showing that, global temperatures over the last 50 or 100 years have really become much more aggressively increasing in relation to the Industrial Revolution than had previously. The historic records showed, the so-called hockey stick graph. Joe Barton, who disputed the scientific reality of climate change, targeted these scientists, saying that their research must be fraudulent, that their use of federal funds was in some way misuse. And even though his investigations also went nowhere, the scientists involved had to testify and produce documents and found themselves subject to his investigatory powers. On the right-hand side is Linda Birnbaum. She, in some ways, is more relevant to today's discussion on advocacy because she was, at the time that this happened, she was a director at the National Institute for Environmental Health Studies, and she, in 2017 or so, had written a paper that said that pesticide regulations had not caught up with the state of science in the last few years. A lot of our pesticide regulations are from the 1970s, and more recent research shows that they're actually more harmful than the regulators at the time had realized. And so she, in her paper, which was published in the Public Library of Science, urged the public and lawmakers to work together to implement more appropriate regulations, more stringent regulations. And she found herself under fire, claiming that she was doing inappropriate advocacy as a federal government employee. This was also an investigation that went nowhere, but Augusta will talk more about ways that federal government employees can make sure that they don't end up in hot water like this. Next slide. And just to explain again that this is not something that is solely the provenance of Republicans. There have been examples of Democrats doing this as well. There was an instance in 2015 where Reantilobbying, following a 2015 New York Times article that talked about the fossil fuel funding behind certain contrarian climate research, Rep. Grijalva went after 7 climate researchers, asking for more information on their funding sources and also asking for emails and correspondence and internal records. And there was pushback against this because even though the request for funding was largely not seen as controversial, the request for records and emails was. This has been a tool that has been used quite frequently among those who want to target scientists, asking for emails and internal documents and such. And intentionally or not, it often has the effect of silencing scientists and making them very circumspect, making them more hesitant to communicate with their colleagues, more hesitant to collaborate, more hesitant to think freely and engage in devil's advocate debates by email, all of which are bad for science. Rep. Grijalva did actually withdraw his request for emails. He, later issued a statement saying he realized now that it was an inappropriate request and he shouldn't have asked for internal documents or correspondence because he realized that it would actually be bad for the scientific endeavor and created a bad precedent. But, he did do it at first. And it's just worth noting that it's happened all over the place in Congress that individual representatives or senators have gotten fired up about some issue or another and have put individual scientists in crosshairs. Next slide. Well, the last thing I will talk about before handing it over to Augusta is just to talk about the ways in which congressional hearings, unfortunately, are not always as effective as they could be. Unfortunately, they can also often be an instance of senators and representatives grandstanding, using industry representatives, creating platforms for them to promote anti-scientific platforms, et cetera. The screenshot here is from a hearing in 2018 that, or sorry, 2017, I believe, that was quite widely covered in the press because one of the representatives involved, Mo Brooks, used it as a platform to say that perhaps sea level rise was not happening because of climate change, but because rocks were falling in the ocean. So that's obviously a pretty extreme example, but you know, I think it goes to show that unfortunately our elected officials aren't always working with the best available science. And there have been a number of instances where these hearings and other congressional processes have been overly influenced by non-scientists posing as scientists or industry representatives posing as scientists, and just generally not being a good example of the ways in which science can be effectively used in the legislative process. So with that, hopefully I've gotten you a little bit of a taste of the ways in which Congress really needs more input from educated scientists and could really benefit from well-positioned scientific advocacy. So I'll hand it to you.
Great, thank you, Lauren. I am, as Lauren just mentioned, my name is Augusta. I am also an attorney with CSLDF, and I'm going to pick it up here to talk a little bit more concretely about how scientists can be involved. Lauren just gave a really, really excellent overview of the ways in which Congress and individual members of Congress can exercise really potent powers relating to scientists that affect not only broadly the conduct of science in the US, but individual scientists. This impact is huge, and many scientists as individuals and also scientific groups and organizations, publications have really been taking note of that recently and have been entering the political forum in new ways. I have a snapshot up here of, as many of you may have seen this a few weeks back, the Scientific American, for the first time in its 175-year history, endorsed a presidential candidate, which was a pretty remarkable event. And there have been a number of instances like that, of scientific organizations getting involved in politics, of scientists as individuals getting involved, even running for office in record numbers. So we know that there's a great deal of interest out there among scientists at this moment, in particular, as we have the election coming up, in interfacing with politics and with their representatives in particular. And so we wanted to talk a little bit about how scientists can do that and what scientists should be aware of as they go to do that. And one of the most important things that scientists should be aware of, and that I'm going to focus on in the rest of my discussion here, is anti-lobbying restrictions. So when I say lobbying, what do I mean specifically? It has a fairly particular legal meaning, and what it means is attempting to influence a politician or a public official in relation usually to some particular piece of legislation, attempting to influence a member of Congress, for example, to pass a piece of legislation or to not pass a piece of legislation, but it can relate to any, really any particular action that you're trying to influence a public official of some kind to do or to not do. And usually it has to do with something that's going to benefit a particular organization or organization's interests in a particular way. So that's what we mean when we say lobbying. And there are some important restrictions around that scientists should be aware of, and I'll talk a little bit more in a second about why this really can be important for scientists. The most important piece of legislation that regulates this whole area to be aware of is called the Anti-Lobbying Act. And what it does is to try to prevent an individual or an organization from using funds that have been appropriated by Congress to go and lobby for their own political aims or to try and go get more funding. And there is a particular amendment to the Anti-Lobbying Act called the Byrd Amendment that is especially important to be aware of, because what it did is to apply some of the restrictions that already were in the Anti-Lobbying Act to those who are recipients of federal grants and also federal loans and contracts. So it expanded the reach of the Anti-Lobbying Act into an area where it actually wasn't before, and to cover those who are using federal grant funds or funds from federal contracts, and to prohibit them from seeking to influence a member of Congress relating to those grants or loans or contracts. So you can see how this could easily apply to scientists either who are federal government employees or who in one way or another are the recipient of federal grants, which is a very common circumstance for many scientists or who work with federal grants. So the really important highlights, and of course this is a complex area of law, and there's quite a lot to talk about. I think we could probably fill up hours with discussions of all of the nuances, but the most important thing to come away with is that generally a scientist can meet with the legislator in order to discuss general policy issues or to present a nonpartisan analysis. This is especially okay if the legislator has requested the meeting, and that's something that happens with some regularity. A legislator is working on a bill that relates to an issue that a particular scientist has expertise in, and their office reaches out to the scientist and says, could you come in and give us a presentation on your work or on this particular scientific issue, because the legislator wants to understand it better while he or she is working on this issue. That type of interaction with the legislator is not going to qualify as lobbying. It's not going to trigger anti-lobbying concerns because you're not requesting any particular action. You're not presenting a partisan analysis or lobbying for any particular bill. You're presenting a nonpartisan analysis. And one thing that's a great general note is that a scientist interacting with the legislator in general, the further you are in your conversation with that legislator from the area of your federally funded work, the safer you will be from having to worry about any anti-lobbying restrictions. So, for example, if you are a scientist who works on climate change in your professional life, either as a federal scientist or using a federal grant, but you are, for example, let's say very concerned about gun legislation, and just as an individual citizen. If you meet with your legislator about the gun legislation that you want to advocate for or against, and you particularly, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, actually you can see later down on the slide, but particularly if you are doing that in your own time as a private citizen and using your own resources. That's very safe territory in terms of anti-lobbying concerns, because you aren't talking to the legislator about the area of your federally funded work. There's very little concern that you're going to find yourself advocating for more funding for your climate work in discussion about, for example, a piece of gun legislation. So these are examples of ways that scientists can make sure that they don't have to worry about triggering those anti-lobbying concerns. And the second really important point, which I just touched on some, is that scientists can meet with the legislator and engage in what actually constitutes lobbying technically. So you are advocating for a particular action or against it, for or against a particular piece of legislation, say, as long as you are doing it without using any federal resources. So you're doing it as a private citizen on your own time, not using federal funding or resources to carry it out. A few sort of just general tips and best practices that I wanted to walk through. And these are useful both for scientists who are federal employees and for scientists who perhaps work for a university or other government-funded lab or even a private institution. These are general go-tos that I think are helpful for all scientists to keep in mind when they are considering entering the political arena, engaging with a legislator. So as I just said, but it bears repeating, it's the very best way to protect yourself from any worries about anti-lobbying restrictions and a host of other concerns is to make sure that you are doing that using your own funds and resources and on your own time. Another thing that it's very useful to think about is to be sure that you've taken time to understand whether any open records laws may apply to you. So if you are a scientist who is a federal employee or working at a government-funded university, for example, open records laws probably do apply to you and to your various records, including your emails. And so it's very good to keep that in mind. And that dovetails nicely into the next pointer here, which is that it's very helpful to try to maintain a nice, clear separation between your personal and professional, including email accounts. So making sure that you, to the best extent you can, use your work email for work correspondence and your personal accounts for your political activities. Same with social media accounts. To the extent you want to engage in advocacy, activism, interfacing with the legislator on social media, it's great to do that from an account that is very clearly a personal account and not associated with your work, keeping good records of working hours so that you have maintained a nice clear line between times when you are working and acting in your professional capacity and times when you are not, particularly with respect to federal grants, and especially if you're a federal employee, can be really useful and important. This sort of goes along with what I've already said, but in terms of making sure that you're using personal resources to engage in these kinds of activities, that does include equipment, things like printers, computers, cell phones that have been issued to you, particularly by a government employer. Definitely a great best practice to try to make sure that you're engaging in your personal political activities on your personal devices and using personal equipment. And last but not least here, it might seem like it almost goes without saying, but we have seen it before. It's a great idea if you are, for example, going to have a meeting with a legislator, or even if you're going to engage in some other political activity like attending a rally or volunteering for a campaign. And if you're doing that as a private citizen, which we highly encourage as a best practice, as I've said, it's a great idea to make sure that you're not wearing any identifying insignia, logo, uniform from your employer, particularly if your employer is a federal employer. Again, to just help maintain that nice clear line between the personal and professional, and to make sure that you're not, unintentionally giving the impression that you are acting in your professional capacity as you're doing that. So another great best practice is if you are going to talk with a legislator or give a political speech, it's a terrific idea to be very explicit and to sort of include disclaimers and make very clear that you are speaking in your personal capacity and not on behalf of your employer. And this can work both, in some kind of verbal presentation. It also can work in the context, for example, of an open letter or other piece of writing. A nice little disclaimer saying that I'm speaking in my personal capacity, and to the extent that your professional affiliation has been identified, which it sometimes is necessary, it can be helpful to say that is for identification purposes only, and that you're not speaking on behalf of your employer. And the last piece of best practice advice that I wanted to make sure to give is that it's always a great idea to take a moment to be sure that you have taken a look at whatever your institution's policies are around political speech. And chances are reasonably good that they have some policies, and to make sure that you understand what they are and are familiar with them, so that everything you're doing is sort of with an awareness of what those policies are, and that'll help you make sure that you are not unintentionally violating them. So I wanted to discuss a little bit what you should do, and again, sort of some tips and best practices if you find that you are somehow in some hot water as a result, for example, of having interacted with the legislator at your workplace. Whether that's a federal workplace or not. This is, again, hopefully helpful for scientists in both those boats. The first thing that it's important to remember is that institutional counsel, the lawyers for your employer who are in-house there, can sometimes be an excellent resource. We have seen, for example, situations where university counsel have been extremely helpful to scientists who found themselves targeted. But it's very important to remember that the institutional counsel doesn't represent you. They only represent the institution, whatever that institution might be, whether it's the agency or the university or whatever it might be. So they represent the interests of that institution, and it may be the case that your interests and the interests of the institution align very well. It may be the case that they don't, but it's important to keep in mind when you're talking to university counsel that they're not your lawyers. And this is a great moment for me to remember to say that if you are a scientist who is finding that you have a legal question, because, for example, because you've been engaging in some kind of political activity and are worried about some kind of fallout. That is exactly the kind of thing that we at CSLDF have very often worked with scientists on, and we offer free and confidential consultations. If you find yourself in a situation where you have a question, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We're very glad to set up a call or email with you and help you understand your situation. And if you're facing internal retaliation, so you're experiencing negative repercussions from inside your workplace, it's very important to understand what channels are available to you internally to challenge that. For example, in many different situations, there are a whole range of different kinds of complaints, grievances, actions that are options for a scientist in order to respond to that kind of internal retaliation. But it's important to understand what they are, the pros and cons of each of them, and the implications of using them. So again, please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have specific questions about an individual situation, and we'll be happy to talk you through them. If you are facing some kind of external targeting, the most important thing to say there is that often, although it might not be the answer everybody's looking for, in many cases, the best thing to do with a certain range of hostile messages is simply to ignore them. However, there are some kinds of external events that should never be ignored. One is a congressional inquiry. And Lauren mentioned the case of Linda Birnbaum, who was accused of violating anti-lobbying laws and was subjected to sort of a whole host of a barrage of inquiries from Congress. And if you are a scientist who's facing that kind of situation, that is absolutely not something to ignore. Important to reach out for support and help as quickly as you can. Another example there is subpoenas. Similarly, if you receive something like that, please do contact us or another lawyer as quickly as you can. Same with records requests. Those are formal requests that you can't afford to let linger. And lastly, we've unfortunately heard examples of scientists who have received truly threatening messages, threats to their health and safety, and that too, of course, should never ever be ignored. And that's a moment to reach out for support as quickly as you can. So I wanted to mention that significant parts of what Lauren and I have talked about today are contained also in some written resources that we have developed for scientists, all of which are available on our website. And you can see a few examples of the kinds of guides that we've developed that have relevant information for scientists who are interested in becoming politically active. And so we hope that you will go take a look at them on our website. They're there for download. And last but not least, I wanted to put up our contact information. As I've mentioned, we are absolutely happy to field individual questions and are available for consultations. So you'll see there both my email address and Lauren's email address and our phone number. So please do feel free to take that down and reach out with specific individual questions. And that said, I think we are actually ready to field any questions that any of the folks who are listening today might have.
Great, thank you so much, Lauren and Augusta. This as always, is incredibly useful information. So we're going to start off with one of the questions that we received in the chat during the webinar, and then we'll move to a few questions that folks submitted ahead of time. So Monica asks, re anti-lobbying, if a student is receiving federal funds to pay for tuition costs, such as through an NSF grant, is any activism that is done as a student, like with a student government organization, subject to anti-lobbying restrictions?
That is a great question. And grants definitely can be sort of a complicated area for these anti-lobbying rules, because it's not always as crystal clear as it is when someone is, is just a salaried federal employee, for example. What is and what isn't federal funds, and how that works. So I'm really glad you asked that question. One thing that's important to mention is that if you receive federal funding as salary, and that can mean either just a traditional paycheck if you're a traditional federal employee, or it can mean if you are the recipient of a federal grant and some portion of that grant money is earmarked as salary, which is, I know from my experience working with scientists, can be the case. Once that salary is received by you and is in your personal bank account, the basic rule is it loses its identity as federal funds. It is no longer federal funds. That money is no longer federal funds. It's your personal funds, and you can use it as you see fit. So you can use it to engage in political activity. And as I was going on about, make sure to, if you're going to engage in something that is lobbying, be sure to do it using your own personal resources. That's exactly what I mean. You can use that funds as your own personal funds and resources. To address a little bit more specifically your question about funding that is designated for tuition costs for a student. So this is where there's sort of the flip side of the coin. In the case of a federal grant or other funding agreement or arrangement where money is designated for something, for example, like tuition costs, it's important to sort of keep those lines clear and make sure that that money, that federal funding, is used only for the purpose that it's supposed to be used for. So that federal money should be used to pay for tuition costs. If you then want to, go on and engage in some activism as a student, you are certainly entitled to do it, as long as you just make nice and sure that you're not using those federal funds to do it. So you want to keep those lines nice and clear and use your personal resources to engage in those activities, and then you should be just fine. And I hope that's an answer to your question there.
This is Lauren. I will just chime in and agree with everything that Augusta said, and say that I think one thing to think about is also, if you're using your federal tuition funds towards, for example, getting a laptop or a phone, to be very careful about using that for any advocacy. So, for example, any resources that were paid for with federal money, it is really not a good idea to use that for personal advocacy, because then there's a claim, however tenuous, that that those resources were used inappropriately under violation of an anti-lobbying restriction. So just in the effort to make as clear as possible that you're doing so in your personal capacity, making sure that you're not using any government funded equipment or your school email that may be related to your federal grant, using your personal email, etc., which is all stuff Augusta said earlier in the presentation, but just bringing it back to this question.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Thank you, Augusta and Lauren. We have another question in the chat here. can federal contractors make political, I think this is donations, using their own personal funds?
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. You know, of course, within the bounds of various campaign contribution restrictions and things like that, limits. But yes, that that does tie in pretty pretty closely with what I was just mentioning. So those personal funds, whether they have been received as salary via a federal contract or from elsewhere, but once they are in your personal bank account, then you are free to use them for a whole variety of activities, including making political donations.
Excellent, thank you. I'm going to move to some of the questions that we got with folks' registration in advance. So one here we have, how at risk are scientists in relation to state level advocacy, particularly for those working at state universities?
Lauren, I feel like I've been talking a lot. I don't know if you want to grab this one, if you have
Oh,
thoughts.
sorry. I was chatting and I didn't realize I was on mute, so thank you. What I was saying was, we didn't get into the state level laws on this. A lot of them do echo the federal laws, but if, the person wanted to reach out to us individually, we could look into the laws of that particular state. But I would say by and large, the same prescriptions hold true. Keep your personal activities very clearly personal. Do not use government money for lobbying. Making that distinction very, very clear.
Great, thank you. The next question we had received in advance was, how should scientists and academics establish collaborative relationships with their offices of government relations?
That is a great question. Caitlin and Liz, I know that you guys at AGU do programming surrounding that, but I'll just chime in to say, as a lawyer, I will say again the importance of distinguishing, any professional versus personal activities. There's also the truth that, if you're reaching out to a congressperson or other lawmaker, providing a scientific briefing is not not prevented under anti-lobbying laws the same way that, say, asking a legislator to vote on a particular piece of legislation is. So, you can always start the conversation with something very broad, something that the anti-lobbying laws are much kinder on, instead of trying to focus on particular pieces of legislation.
Yeah, I think I'll say too, like you just said, making sure you're distinguishing that sort of the personal from the professional. So if you're lobbying for something that has to do with your research that's helping the university, it's great to just reach out to the contacts and let them know that you are interested in forming a relationship with your member of Congress, and they're a great avenue to connect you to your member of Congress to talk about those issues. But yeah, if it's something outside of your research in a professional capacity, they're probably not the best avenue. But Liz, did you have anything else you wanted to add to that?
Thanks, Caitlin. Yeah, I would say we definitely have a lot of opportunities in programming around this. If people want to learn more, definitely be on the lookout for fall meeting programming, because we'll cover this and a lot of related topics. So definitely check that out.
Okay, let me see if there are, I don't see any other questions that are in the question box right now, but as Liz just said in the chat, please feel free to drop in any questions that you have. I think Liz and I had some questions that we thought might be useful for Augusta and Laura to answer that are common questions I think we've heard when we've done some webinars around this topic. So one thing we were thinking is, what are some common questions that CSLDF gets from scientists who are seeking your advice on this topic?
This is Lauren. I'll start off by saying I think we did get one of the earliest questions was just to clarify that, folks can definitely use their personal funds. For example, if you're employed by a federal contractor, you can donate your personal funds. There are prohibitions against the contractors themselves, the LLC or partnership or whatever, making prohibitions. But once it is your salary and it is in your bank account as your personal money, you can spend it as you see fit. So that is definitely a common misconception that I hope we cleared up today. I guess, are there any other questions that we didn't get asked that we should answer?
I guess one thought that comes to mind, and it did actually come up a little bit. I've found that we frequently, when we go to conferences especially, we hear from students who are perhaps in doctoral programs or similar, and are in a little bit of a non-traditional situation because they are students, but in many functional ways they are also employees and have questions about how they can or cannot engage in various kinds of advocacy. So we talked a little bit about how to sort of think about funding and use of funding as you're trying to do that. We definitely field questions about how that kind of interfaces with First Amendment rights, and the answer is it is complicated, but students absolutely should not feel that they have given up their First Amendment rights to engage in political speech simply because they've become affiliated with a university or other institution. And so those are, that's another common one.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Another question that we thought might be of interest to folks is, do these same rules of engaging with members of Congress apply with a candidate versus a sitting member of Congress?
I think the answer to that is probably going to be yes, because someone, especially someone who's officially a candidate for office, is probably going to be considered a public official, and particularly if you're in that domain of advocating that they take or don't take a particular action, or get behind or oppose a particular bill. I do think that it certainly could trigger some of those concerns.
Yeah, this is Lauren. Yeah, this is Lauren. I think that would fall under the Hatch Act, which was discussed at a previous AG webinar. I don't believe that that's up yet, but it will be up shortly. And there are restrictions in how employees and others who receive federal money can engage with campaigns, and it largely falls to the same types of prescriptions. You can't be using your federal resources or role in furthering a campaign, but you can do so as a private citizen.
Excellent. Thank you both so much. One final question that we had was, are there often resources available to help with these issues on campuses or at institutions? And should scientists check with their campus or institution before going to outside counsel like CSLDF?
That is a personal decision. As Augusta said, there are some institutional councils that are very amenable to working with scientists and see themselves very aligned. There are others who are not so open-armed. I would say that if you're deciding on what to do and you're feeling torn, one option could be to ask a trusted mentor in the department and just get an understanding of how the general counsel's office comports itself. Certainly, we keep all correspondence confidential, so you could always reach out to us and just talk through your options, and we would keep our duty of confidentiality very seriously, and we wouldn't be doing anything to, advertise that a scientist came to us while they were deciding what to do.
That's great, thank you. And we had another question come into the chat box. What is the most legal trouble that I could get into if I do something incorrectly or unintentionally break the rules, trying to be politically active as a scientist?
That is a great question. It really depends on what your role is. I mean, if you're a federal employee, I mean, I think the worst thing that could happen is that you would be fired. That happens rarely in these sorts of things, but it could happen. More likely outcome if you're a federal grant recipient is that you could be forced to return some monies or lose your grant or even be prohibited from receiving grants in the future. Those are all pretty worst case scenarios, I would say. I don't see them as super likely, but that does not mean that like people should be cavalier about this. The more likely scenario that we've had to deal with folks in the worst case scenario is just these investigations and having to explain themselves. I mean, most of the scientists we've worked with, they're not trying to violate anti-lobbying laws. They're not trying to subvert the process. It's like they just get tangled up in some aspect they didn't fully understand, and so it's a good faith mistake, and that usually comes out in the wash. But it can be a very ugly process to get that sorted out. So it is better to be prepared ahead of time. Ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, kind of thing.
Yeah, and I'll just add quickly, I do believe that there can, I mean, in really extreme scenarios, and I think this is highly unlikely, but it's just worth mentioning in response to this question. In sort of the most extreme violations, I do believe there can be civil penalties. I think it used to be there could, in some circumstances, be criminal penalties, but that's no longer the case. But there can, I think, potentially be civil penalties. But as Lauren just said, I think she outlined much more likely, realistic worst case scenarios for a scientist.
All right, great. Thank you both so much. It doesn't look like there are any other questions in the chat, and those were all the questions that Liz and I came up with. So Augusta and Lauren's contact information is available on this slide. So if anyone has any other questions they would like to ask in private, please go ahead and reach out to them. We are also available at AGU if you have any other questions that you might have. So thank you all so much for joining on this webinar today. We should have this webinar and our previous webinar on the Hatch Act and more political engagement posted to our YouTube site in the next week, and you should receive a recording of this webinar in the next day or so. So thank you everyone so much for your afternoon.